process. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening.
Yesterday, there was the annual National Prayer Breakfast organized by both the houses of the Parliament of the Republic of Kenya. And I was privileged to represent our university college there. The event that took place in Safari Park Hotel was also attended by the President and his deputy and hundreds of dignitaries. So every now and then in Kenya, we have events like that. Leaders of Kenya, different groups come together to talk, pray, and discuss about unity and peace in Kenya. How much of these initiatives might contribute to sustainable unity and peace in Kenya is a valid query. The key word here is sustainability. We all have very short-term memories. I'm still an Indian, and so my remarks are very provisional and tentative. I make them as academician. I have been part of the Kenyan history since the first multi-party elections of 1992. And what I have heard, and so I came here after that event, and I was walking up and down and in and out of this conference, and I heard a lot of grassroots experiences of peace building. But I tend to think that peace and conflict, let's say conflict, also is a systemic problem. And systemic problems need systemic solutions as well. And so what the Commissioner called affirmative action. So I like to propose 4 points. I know you're all tired. I'm also tired. But I indulge in your patience and ask for a serious hearing of this. I have been sort of experimenting with myself in my mind about these thoughts. And in the context of yesterday's event and today's conclusion of this conference, I'd like to propose these 4 points. They are principles and strategies. They are drawn from socio-economic theories of contemporary thinkers. They are drawn from biblical tradition and the social teaching of the church. The first, so if we want sustainable peace in Kenya, I think we need to highlight the principle of the stewardship of the land. Since I'm not a Kenyan, I have the courage to speak about the land issue. The issue of land distribution is a time bomb in Kenya. Every now and then, especially around the elections, the issue comes up and then it is brushed aside under the carpet. If we pretend to have our heads hidden in the sand like the proverbial ostrich, we are likely to be taken aback by an attack from behind. Kenyans need to talk about this issue and talk about it squarely with a lot of respect for history. I propose a principle here and a legal framework. One of the directions of solution to the problem of land could be the principle of stewardship that flows from the Hebrew scriptures. When I say Hebrew scriptures, what Christians call Old Testament. The Bible alludes to the fact that no human being owns land on planet Earth. It belongs to God, the Almighty. All lands belong to the Almighty. To Yahweh belong earth and all it contains. Psalm 24 verse 1. People are temporarily entrusted with the stewardship of land according to their need to cultivate and to take care of it. Genesis 2:15. The book of Leviticus, therefore, asserts land must not be sold in perpetuity. For the land belongs to me, declares Yahweh. And every 7 years, 7 times 7 years, after 49 years, and the 50th year will be the Jubilee year when land will be redistributed equally. You will declare this 50th year to be the sacred year and proclaim liberation to all countries' inhabitants. You will keep this as jubilee. Is this possible in Kenya? A concrete legal framework might be needed in the form of a land ceiling policy. Now you might say, Selvam, you're a foreigner, you don't know what is Kenya. Yeah, true, I don't know. But we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it. So, land ceiling policy, stipulation of how much land an individual or a family could own, has to be put in place. Now, to do that, I understand that it is only possible only when individuals and families, some of who are in current leadership, agree magnanimously to give away their grabbed lands to the people who are considered squatters in their own land. This surely needs further exploration, and I leave it at that. The second principle and a strategy is towards a maximum wage principle, a wage ceiling. Some of the happiest countries in the world, I'm specialized in positive psychology, and we do a lot of things about happiness and well-being. And there is an international global ranking of countries, of happiest countries. Some of the happiest nations in the world today are also the most flat societies. Flat societies, such as Denmark, for example. When someone's remuneration for an hour as a consultant is equivalent to his watchman's salary for the whole month, the watchman is likely not to be happy. And the money adds no value to the happiness of the boss as well. After all, research has repeatedly shown that money does have an impact on happiness, but only up to a threshold point. I have references here, you can look at them. The Bible, this time the Gospel of Luke, warns us that insensitivity to this reality of the gap might lead to an irreversible abyss between the poor Lazarus sitting at the bosom of the father, Abraham, and the rich man in Hades. Luke 16. The breadcrumbs that slipped out of the table of the master were not sufficient to bridge that gap. The trickle-down economy is not just working. Most countries today have a minimum wage policy. The minimum wage does not ensure equal distribution of wealth. Some social and economic thinkers have suggested a maximum wage policy. From a social perspective, it flattens the society. From an economic perspective, I'm not an economist, but I tend to think, from an economic perspective, wage ceiling could arrest inflation and devaluation of currency. Economists, I leave it to you to discuss that. Is it possible? Again, you might ask. Let's talk about it. What have we seen in Kenya in the past 5 years? Just 5 years. It has been repeated. The parliamentarians raise their pay. The teachers go on strike. The health workers and the doctors go on strike. Everyone's wage is raised. Inflation. So what happens to the unga price? What happens to the farmer who has to pay for education and health care? What happens to him? What is the alternative he has if the food products are not raised, the price of food products are not raised up? And all of us want cheap food, but high salary towards maximum wage. Third point related to that, famine. Famine is not correlated to drought. I'm not misusing that word correlation. I teach research methods. I know the meaning of correlation. One of the signs of failure of the trickle-down economy is the news about famine in Kenya almost every year. Not almost every year, but it is interesting to note that the famines are acute whenever Kenya goes to the polls and referendums. Is there a correlation there? Of course, the most naive causal explanation is drought. One of my countrymen, a former countryman, a Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen, got his Nobel Prize for Economics in the 1970s for arguing that there is no correlation and much less no causal relationship between drought and famine. He examined the famous Bengal famine, one of the worst famines in the world's history, being a Bengali himself. Counterintuitive as it might seem, famine is caused by conflicts and war, lack of planning, lack of infrastructure, marginalization, or greedy businessmen hoarding up food in order to artificially hike up the prices. Consider a simple demonstration of this. In the 1980s, the famine in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa made the world move with compassion. You remember Michael Jackson's song, "We Are the World." This year, Ethiopia also experienced the same drought as Kenya, but not as the same level of famine. What happened? I was in Ethiopia 2 years ago, traveling between Adigrat and Adwa, which are semi-arid areas, rocky areas. And in the 1980s, that was the epicenter of famine. And I was discussing with the fellow priest who was driving me, and I told him about Amartya Sen's theory, that there is no correlation between drought and famine. And we were driving on a new road, a tarmac road from Adigrat to Adwa. And he told me, "Father, how true it is. Now we get fresh fruits in Adwa because of the road. Food travels by itself." Kenyans tend to have short-term memory. After this year's famine, everything will be forgotten until another famine. The policy of devolution holds promise that road construction, food storage, inclusion of the people, the commissioner talks about inclusion of the people of these communities into mainstream political processes are likely to solve the annual food crisis, even if climate change should cause more droughts. My fourth and last point, collective narrative. Kenya needs collective narrative. We are talking about sustainable peace. Collective narrative. Harari has been most cited in last session, and incidentally I have also his citation. He points out that when a group of human beings get larger, we need different ways to sustain the groups. Numbers, group of people, 7 to 12 people is the ideal group. He says they can be sustained through a common motivation. When it gets more than 12, you need the gossip. So gossip is good, that sustains group. More than 150, I don't know how he calculated the threshold point. He says we need myths, what he calls fiction, and he relates even religion to that. That part I am a little bit critical of. Kenya needs collective narratives. Narratives consist of symbols, stories, and histories. And happily for me, I have been talking about this for many years in Kenya. Happily for me, yesterday and the day before, led by Honorable Ore Kaparo, there was a discussion on national anthem and unity. And I think that is what I'm talking about here. collective narrative. National anthem is the narrative, and the narrative around the national anthem becomes the collective narrative. And there's a beautiful video clip I wish they could be telecasted in the national channels. This is the way forward. In addition, Kenya has to rewrite its history textbooks. Reconsider some of the compulsory readings in literature. If Bishop was telling us how the father taught him about unity, children have to be taught. How? Not by a continued rhetoric of moaning about colonialism. That's not going to take us forward. I come from a former colony, and we have had almost 450 years of colonial history, starting with the Danish, the Portuguese, the French, the British. But Indian textbooks are not continuing to mourn about colonialism. So we need to rewrite our textbooks. We need to reselect our compulsory readings. Will our continued critique of Western influence take us forward? Will our lopsided narratives about freedom struggle unite us? That is why we need collective narrative. Narratives create identities. Conclusion. Am I proposing too much of control and infringement of individual rights? Right to ownership, right to property. One of the influential moral philosophers, contemporary philosophers, Alistair MacIntyre, has argued that there is no democracy without control. Democracy is not simply possible without control. In Germany, denial of the Holocaust is a crime. Now, what about freedom of expression, you might ask? But that is democracy. What is democracy then in a society with controls? Simply when we, the people, collectively agree to allow some of our liberties to be fenced in order to safeguard our collective well-being, we exercise democracy. And exercise it magnanimously. In fact, it is the only way, it is only this way we make democracy possible. Collective processes are expressions of democracy. I believe peace is possible in the world, and sustainable peace is possible in Kenya. However, it cannot be brought by just sweet rhetoric and some mere prayers. We need affirmative action. My simple reflection is centered around some hypothetical principles and strategies. They're hypothetical for Kenya, not in a theoretical way as social scientists have discussed. So on that basis, I rest my case and thank you.